in the US, and there's a large Spanish-speaking population there. My Spanish teacher was from Argentina, so I grew up learning about all the Argentinian soccer players. I also grew up playing soccer, football, and so it was always a childhood dream. You know, I hear you all have a team, Sedecao. So I heard about that, and I was like, oh, that'd be great to one day be able to play in Brazil. Yesterday, we went to the big park. Ricardo took us there, the park. I didn't get to play, but I did get to see a lot of people playing, which you would never see this in the United States, this many people just out playing football. And so that was a childhood dream. This isn't quite a childhood dream to speak with you all, more of an adulthood dream to be able to travel here and speak with you all. So I appreciate that. Today, I should also say the original plan for this presentation was not using PowerPoint, but rather to use like a different presentation format. And because I'm not able to connect my computer to the projector, they thought it might be easier if I use the computer in the auditorium. So these slides are going to be a little formatted differently than intended. So I apologize for that. So for example, like this slide transition where you saw there's this thing on the bottom here, that was supposed to show up later on. So with that said, I do also want to mention that all of these slides will be available. I'm going to send these to Antonio, and they're also available on my research group's website, which I'll try and pull up at the end here. But the point is, these will all be available. They're going to be rendered to a PDF document rather than a PowerPoint. So they'll look more like notes than just like a typical slide deck. Just keep that in mind. Another thing I'll say is that there are a lot of slides here, more than I think is useful for us and that we'll be able to get through all today. But my goal for this was to try and talk a little bit about learning theory, some principles from cognitive science, talk about some practical applications for you all to consider adopting, talk about some strategies. So the point is, there's a lot of material here. My goal with these kinds of talks is to just try and make sure everyone has something that they can take home with. But of course, because we're all different ideas and concepts will resonate differently. So just keep in mind, like, that's the approach that I took for this talk. With that said, there are these 5 learning objectives with the talk. So identifying key challenges in assessing student learning, applying cognitive sciences principles, and that's actually where we'll start. We'll get to a roadmap slide in a second. The third is just talking about implementation strategies. We'll talk about a specific kind of framework that you can consider using. And then evaluating student work, so maybe talking about different rubrics, different ways for grading, and then thinking about sort of access and equitable practices. So the goal at the end is just to make some connections between principles and theories and what you can actually do in your courses when you're teaching. Right? So that's the idea. Roadmap-wise, I'm just going to go ahead and skip through this. It's not going to look very good, but so there's these 5 parts. There's this theoretical foundation, which I mentioned earlier, so talking about some basic concepts from learning sciences. Then it's talking about assessment challenges, maybe how to think about reframing those. Talking about maybe shifting paradigms and approaches to assessment. Then talk about specific framework, and finally, some approaches to grading. So that's the idea. There's going to be a little bit about change management there as well. So if you're someone going back to your home discipline or your home department, and maybe you want to see change happen across your other courses in your department, maybe how to think about that as well. All right, so that's the idea. All right, so to get us started, I want to think about this hypothetical scenario, okay? So the scenario is 2 students submit identical thermodynamic solutions. One student documented 47 minutes of AI interaction with like iterative prompt refinement, so they're working back and forth with some sort of AI system or ChatGPT, let's say. The other student submitted no documentation, but both solutions were technically correct. And the question for you all to think about is 2 things. 1, how do you grade those 2 versions? And then as you're thinking about that, I'm also going to ask you all, just, is this happening in your class? So think for a few seconds, just how might you approach grading those 2 student assignments? And then also think, wait, is this actually happening in my class right now? How am I handling that? All right, and then a show of hands for how many people is this kind of experience actually happening right now? So for how many people do you actually have this kind of thing where students submit some homework, some are doing a good job documenting AI use, others maybe not, but you suspect it. So a few people, more than a few people, all right. All right, cool. So keep that kind of thing in mind, and hopefully by the end of today, we'll have talked about some strategies that you might consider using in your courses to help with that, all right? Well, like I said, first, we'll start with some theoretical foundation. So this may not be the most exciting part of the talk, but I think it's helpful. I think it's also probably one of those places where hopefully there's some ideas that are new to you that you could use in your own courses and lectures, right? And so there's going to be a series of these theoretical frameworks. Talk a little bit about why theory matters, just to set the stage, but it's really going to be talking about self-regulated learning, metacognition, constructivist frameworks or approaches to teaching, and then backward design for assessment and specifically for AI-related assessment. And then we'll try and tie those together. Okay, so those are the pieces that we'll go through. There's plenty more. This is just a selection that I have found useful in my own work. And along the way, we'll try and answer these questions like how do students learn with AI tools? What might be some cognitive processes that we should assess? How do we scaffold that kind of work? All right, and then by the end, we'll be able to hopefully tie some research foundation to what we're actually doing. All right, I'll also say we saw there's going to be like these 5 kind of blocks for this slide deck, and each of them is going to have a similar format where, you know, start with it, here's what we're going to talk about, here's the objective, we'll go through that material, then at the end, sort of a recap and then move on. So just keep in mind like that's going to be the general framework. We'll go for this. I guess technically we started a few minutes late. The goal is to maybe go for about an hour and then have some discussion, but also because I'd like this to be as informal as possible, if at any point anyone does have a question, wants to talk about anything, please raise your hand and we can do that because 2 things. 1, I don't like to hear the sound of my own voice. I'm sure you don't want to hear it either. And 2, I suspect the conversation is what's going to be the most helpful. So you'll be doing everyone a favor if you actually ask a question. All right, so why theory matters. So the idea here is, well, you could come up with some ways for doing things, but if you actually had a more principled approach, then maybe it's going to scale well. You're going to actually have some ways to justify what you're doing, which also translates to how you talk to your students about what you're doing in the class. You can be very clear about what the expectations are for your students. It makes it a little bit easier, maybe, to defend why you're making certain assessment decisions, and then can just be very deliberate about connecting back to actual learning science and research in that area to what you're doing in your classroom. So trying to close that loop between research and practice. Okay, so with that, like I said, evidence-based assessment design, trying to be coherent, and then aligning with learning objectives. And this alignment piece is what's going to show up when I start talking about backward design principles in a few minutes. Keep that in mind. All right, we don't need that. So let's just go ahead and jump straight to this first theory. So this is self-regulated learning. And for each of these 4 or 5 principles or ideas, I want to be very interested to know like who's heard of these before. So again, show of hands, who's heard of this idea of self-regulated learning? Right, awesome. So okay, so that's good. This either means that nobody's raising their hand because nobody wants to raise their hand, or y'all actually haven't heard about this. And if it's the second version, that's great because it's an opportunity for me to teach you all something new. Okay, so self-regulated learning in 30 seconds. There's an entire field of research, right? Okay, so I'm going to do it a disservice by not spending the next 20 minutes talking about this, but high-level ideas. Oh, I see what happened. Okay, well, this is an instance where the formatting got messed up. All right, so there's going to be 3 phases, or at least 3 primary phases when thinking about self-regulated learning. And this is how students can regulate their own learning, right? So the 3 phases are going to be a forethought phase, like a planning phase, a performance phase, like actually as they're in the process of what they're doing, and then a reflection phase. And what I suspect is going to happen is that that third phase isn't going to show up here on the slides, which is unfortunate. But the forethought phase, like I said, goal setting, so some strategic planning, self-efficacy beliefs. Okay, so let's pause here for a second. Who's heard of this term, self-efficacy? And I know that maybe that's a specialized English term anyways. So this is the idea of like, do you believe in your ability to perform or do a task? Okay, so it's related to work and motivation, thinking about how motivated are people to engage in activities. And the idea is if you have a high self-efficacy, if you have a high belief in your ability to complete a task, then maybe you're more likely to engage in that task. So for your students, if they have high self-efficacy, should have done this at the beginning, pause. Who here teaches an engineering course? Okay. Oh, okay, I suppose. And then what are some other non-engineering departments that people may be from? Yeah. Mathematics? Okay. Yeah. Physics, okay, great. All right, awesome. Okay, so I can stick with the calculus example, and I think we're still gonna probably be on the same, all right, cool. So if a student has a high self-efficacy in their ability to solve a second order differential equation, like an integral, right, then maybe they're going to be more likely to engage in that. That's going to be some idea around self-efficacy beliefs. And then task analysis. So that's basically them ability to, like them analyzing what is the task that they need to perform and what does that involve, right? So that's forethought. Performance is actually as they're engaged in that process. So they're monitoring as they're engaging in that solution to the integral, let's say. Self-instruction, so them teaching themselves, or not teaching themselves, but basically setting out, okay, I'm going to do this next step, I'm doing this next step, and so on. Seeking help, so when they get stuck, do they know that they are stuck, and that they're then going to try and find help to get unstuck, and then thinking about their strategies. All right, and this third phase, because it's not going to show up, is reflection. So now that they've completed that task, they are reflecting what worked, what didn't work, and then they're going to go ahead and move right into the planning phase. Okay, well, for next time, what can I do differently? So that's this idea of how you have these three phases that form a cycle of self-regulated learning. And I have a couple of examples here that are just more specific to engineering rather than that math example that I gave, but they illustrate the same idea. All right, so that's the first framework. Like I said, we're going to go very quickly through these. Second one is metacognition, which relates closely self-regulated learning. Here, it can kind of get, breaking it down, so it's thinking about thinking, right? So meta, like above, cognition, so how you're thinking about your thinking. And it's going to be an awareness of your own thought processes. Here, you can kind of break this down into two big sides. Metacognitive knowledge, so it's going to be like person knowledge, so knowledge about yourself, or the student's knowledge about themselves. Task knowledge, knowledge about what they need to be doing, and then strategy knowledge, like how can they go about doing that task. So that's on the metacognitive knowledge side, and then there's metacognitive regulation. So that's going to look very similar to self-regulated learning. So planning, performance or monitoring here, and then evaluating or reflection is what that was in self-regulated learning. Okay, so the idea here is how helping students think about what they're doing, how they're thinking. And this will show up. We're doing these frameworks now so that when we talk about them later on, it's clear like how this shows up in specific strategies that I'll talk about, and we can make connections like, hey, this is why I'm suggesting this because it's connected to self-regulated learning or because it's connected to metacognitive knowledge. So that's what we're doing. We're sort of setting the stage, as they might say. All right, so let's think about this for a second, just to try and put these two theories into action. All right, so the setup is a senior design student must design a pedestrian bridge using AI tools while demonstrating engineering competency, right? And so now what I want to think about is what would it look like to use these principles or these ideas from self-regulated learning and metacognition in this setup, right? So with the self-regulated learning, it might look like students thinking, all right, I'll use AI to, in this case, explore trust configurations. Right? So that's them planning what they're going to do with AI. Then they might actually perform. So they might say, okay, AI suggested using a warrant trust, so a certain kind of bridge design. Student then thinks, all right, like, does this match my hand calculations. So they're going to do their own calculations and do this comparison exercise and then reflect. So they might say, well, AI helped here, got it wrong here. So how do I sort of make sense of that? Why do I think I'm right and the AI isn't right? So it's this sort of critical engagement or critical thinking. And then they can think next time when I'm using AI, here's how I can maybe help it not make that same mistake. That's what that would look like. On the metacognitive awareness side, it'd be like, well, I know I personally struggle with dynamic analysis, for example. So here's how I'm going to maybe be careful when I'm using AI because I may not be able to trust it as well, or I'm going to need to rely on it more, things like that. So that's the person knowledge showing up. Task knowledge, so saying this bridge needs to be created, creative, but also safe. So I can use AI first, and then I ensure second, so I come along. So that's maybe thinking about the task itself, and then strategy. So how exactly will I do this? Will I then first brainstorm with the AI, ask it to perform some calculations, and reflect on those calculations? So actually thinking about the steps that, having a student think about the steps that they'll go through. All right. So that's kind of what that could look like. And then as you're evaluating that, you would think, all right, we need to evaluate the technical solutions and the quality of the learning process. And this is one thing that'll show up a few more times throughout, is this idea of not just looking or evaluating on the output, but also evaluating on the process. Right? So how did a student get to those solutions when they were using AI? And also having the students document that whole process. The point is that documentation process is part of this self-regulated learning, ideally. All right, so next principle is going to be around constructivism. Now, sitting up front here is a graduate student in our program at Virginia Tech, Mitch. So Mitch, can you raise your hand real quick? All right, great. All right, so Mitch specializes in a lot of things. One thing that Mitch really likes to talk about, and I apologize for saying this, Mitch, one thing Mitch really likes to talk about is learning theories and constructivism and different forms of constructivism. So I'm going to apologize to Mitch for what I'm about to do to one of his favorite topics, because I'm not going to do it enough justice. Keep that in mind. But constructivism, so you may, who's heard of the name Vygotsky? All right, so a few more people. All right, so this is going to be a theory that's often associated with him. There's lots of other people, but Vygotsky in particular. And so the idea behind constructivism is that there's going to be a learning is like an active process where learners construct knowledge, that's where the constructivism comes from, through experience and reflection, okay? And so the idea here is we're going to think about how can we be embedding constructivist principles into what we're having our students do by having them actively engage, having this metacognition of them thinking about what they're doing, being very intentional about that as they're using AI, right? Because I think the possibility is that the opposite happens. Students just use AI and there's no critical engagement with that. They're not really thinking about what they're doing. That's kind of, then therefore they're not even engaging in this constructive process. All right, so there are a couple of ideas related to constructivism that we're going to talk about. First one that I wanted to mention was this notion of a zone of proximal development. It gets abbreviated to ZPD for short. So you'll see that in slides later, just ZPD, and just know that's what this is referring to. So who's heard of this term, zone of proximal development? Okay, so the idea here is that students have some tasks they can perform by themselves, other tasks that they might be able to perform with the help of someone or something else, and then tasks that they may not be able to perform with assistance. And it's this middle ground, tasks that they can perform with the assistance of something or someone else. That's going to be that zone of proximal development. So not quite where they are now, but after a little bit more development, that's where they'll be. Right? So the idea is how can you use AI to help students reach that zone of proximal development to then continue their own development process. Right? So it's going to be more as like AI as like the more knowledgeable other, right? The assistant that is helping the students in that process. And another term that you'll see here a lot is around scaffolding. So how do you scaffold exercises to provide students that assistance to be able to perform that task? Another term is social construction. So there's constructivism, then there's social constructivism, which is going to emphasize more this idea that learning is a social process, right? So you're learning through interaction with other people, other tools, In this case, we'll be talking about AI tools, but that's also their classmates as well. Then you can start to think about, well, maybe the line starts to get a little blurry between AI as other person versus other thing, and so on. Now, we're going to not go too far down that road, but just keep in mind, we're talking about using any sort of resource external to the student themselves in helping them with that learning process. And so you can, again, have peers who are doing reviewing, AI that's doing reviewing. And an example that I gave down here was just student shares AI prompting strategies for circuit optimization with other students, right? So you can imagine in your course, you form small groups. Students then share their strategies for interacting with AI in some way, and that's an example of what that social construction would look like. Okay, moving on to the fourth principle now. So backward design. Same question as before. What am I about to ask you all? I'm going to ask you all a question, yeah.
So, well, about backward design.
Yeah. So I want to ask you all, who's heard of backward design principles?
Yeah, I heard, and I can perhaps explain in my own words. You think first. I would use as an example the idea that you want to get to some place, and then you think, okay, I want to go there, and how do we establish the steps to go there? So if you think of a staircase in education, normally you do the contrary. Oh, I will do an engineering course. Okay, what do we put in the first year? Calculus, oh, in the second, and then you go up. But the backward design, for me, in fact, says that I need to go from where should I go, and then go back to what I need to have that goal.
Yeah, perfect, great. So this idea, that's exactly it. So backward design, the idea is start with your learning objectives. What are the objectives and outcomes that you want your students to achieve in your course by the end of the semester? Okay, that's your starting point. Then you work backwards. You think, okay, I don't know what just happened. Right? Then you think, all right, if that's where they need to be, how will I know that they've reached that? So you move from your learning objectives and outcomes to your assessments. Right? This is the evidence that I will have, that I know students have achieved that. Then once you have those assessments, you say, all right, what are the activities that students will need to engage with? What's the content that they will need to be able to perform well on those assessments, to be able to achieve those learning objectives? So that's that idea of backward design. Start with your learning objectives. That informs how you design the rest of your course. Let's see. So it's going to get off again, but it's basically just what I discussed. Oh, I also want to say this is not a slide deck thing. It's just my one of my favorite theories. Mitch is going to roll his eyes because he's heard me lecture about this too much. So me asking you all about what do you think I'm going to ask next is an instance of a theory called active inference, or an instance of like predictive processing. So for people in like maybe information systems or electrical engineering, maybe this idea is a little familiar, but for everyone else, maybe it's not. But this idea of predictive processing, the idea is, and this is a theory about how our brains operate sometimes, it is your brain's always trying to make predictions about what to expect in the world. And when there's gaps between what you predict and what you actually observe, so you're always making these predictions and you're taking in sensory input, as you have these gaps between that prediction and that sensory input, that's the signal to your brain to learn something and update neural connections so that the next time it is in a similar situation, it can make a better prediction. So me asking you all, what do you think I'm going to ask next, is an instance of me trying to basically trigger that process of you all having to stop and think and make that prediction. So I mentioned that because I really love that theory of thinking about how we engage in the world. And I also like doing that in class Because the idea is, if you can get your students to sort of be able to anticipate what you're going to do next, then they have learned something about the world and how you're doing things in class, and hopefully that means they also can anticipate what you're going to say next, and then if they can do that, then they probably have some understanding of the material and so on, right? So I like doing that sort of exercise in class because, again, it sort of gives students that, that practice. That's a giant digression. Okay, so stage one, desired results. Like I said, that's going to be learning objectives, learning outcomes. What should students be able to do at the end? If you have accreditation standards and accreditation criteria that you're working about, might be set by those organizations. So specifically to AI, right, might be what are the understandings about AI in engineering that we want students to have? Then there's this assessment evidence piece. So what evidence do we need to collect that will then show us that a student has achieved that objective? It might be something related to AI literacy, but this really applies not just to AI-related outcomes. Okay, so there's a big image. This is not for now. This is for when you have those slides later, for you able to reference and just see how these tie together, right? So the whole point is to be able to take the big step back and see how everything connects together. When you actually have the slide deck, then you'll be able to use that more usefully. Okay, but the big idea is just pull these together. This will then inform what we'll do with the remainder parts of the talk and talking about strategies. Okay, but I wanted to give you all a break from listening to me talk. So now we're going to do a think, pair, share activity. Okay, so this may be something that you call something different, but the idea is think on a question that's here. So this question, which of these theoretical frameworks most resonates with your current teaching philosophy and how might it change your approach to assessment? So that's the question that I want you all to think about. So that's the thinking part. Then pair, so work with someone else to just discuss, okay, what were your thoughts? And then share, so the idea is then we all come together as a group and share what you were thinking about. Right, so this is basically supposed to be a 5-minute exercise. We'll start with 2 minutes of just thinking to yourselves. When you're ready, or at the end of those 2 minutes, go ahead and start sharing with someone next to you, with your pair, and then after another couple of minutes of that discussion, we'll share out as a group. All right? Questions about that? All right, awesome. I've got it on my watch. I'll keep us moving along if it doesn't look like anyone's talking after a couple of minutes. Thanks. Yeah, I do. Yes. Well, yes. What's the best way to do this? The answer is yes. Sorry, the answer is yes. So it's probably, yeah, those ones on the left, is that gonna, in that left column, it's probably, that's a little too, trying to think how I can make that a little bigger. Hold on, give me 1 second. Is that a little better or a little easier to read? All right. And then just a reminder, the question for you all to think about is just which of these resonates or resonates with your own approach or your own teaching philosophy, then how might any of these inform your own practices? Now, of course, hopefully by the end of this entire talk, you'll have more ideas. So this is really just to give you all a chance to think now before we go on. 2 minutes, although maybe it's now 1 minute. But. All right. So all right, now I'm going to go back to the think, pair, share slide. And then the question is really just to ask about the share part. So we thought for a couple minutes, we shared for a couple minutes. Sorry, we paired for a couple minutes, and now I'm going to ask you all to share. All right. All right, so who would like to share? I'm not going to go around the room, just a couple people. Who can share what you all talked about?
I can try to start.
Thank you.
Not really sure what to share. We discussed a little bit
Yeah.
some ideas and
Yeah, whatever.
of what how we do in class and different approaches. Don't know exactly.
Well, so I think you all had raised your hands a little bit that you knew, or at least had heard of some of these frameworks before. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so were you all already implementing any of these, or you had just heard about them?
Some of it
Yeah.
just heard about it. Some
Yeah.
of it we do use it. Some of it we wanted to use.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Great. Awesome. Thank you. All right. Can we have one? Oh yeah. Maybe one more share before we move on. Yeah.
Hello. We discussed it and we decided that the back design
Yeah.
with the self-assessment learning, it
Yeah.
would be a good combination. So you establish the path and the desired outcome, then you
Yeah.
provide the tools for the students to.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Behind you, there was one more, maybe.
I actually discussed it with him, but
Oh.
we were thinking about like I think backward design is a really interesting choice to like know where you want your students to be, so you can be in the same page at the end of the teaching. But we also thought about actually he brought it up about combining two strategies and like not just choosing one, but maybe we resonate the most with combining two. I think that was really cool. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you all. All right. So I think there's one or two more of these think, pair, share later on. But now that we know how this works, I won't explain it again. Okay. So we're going to move on. This is the end of block one. So this was just talking about some of this theoretical foundation that we'll then talk about how to apply later on. Okay, we talked about these theories already. This is more just for reference for when you have the slide deck later on and you want to be able to reference these. It's just a reminder, right? So we talked about self-regulated learning, metacognition, constructivism, backward design principles, and talked about a few implications and practical applications, right? So that's just wrapping up part one. And now that connects back to one of those learning objectives from the beginning of the first slide. All right. So two, now talking about some assessment challenges and maybe ways to reframe them. All right, so roadmap-wise, what we'll cover, a little bit of authorship ambiguity, and foundational versus enhanced skills. And this is going to make connections back to, does anyone remember from 10 minutes ago, what does ZPD stand for? It's a zone of proximal development. So it's zone of proximal development. So the idea is what can your students do? What can they do with assistance? That's that zone of proximal development. All right, and then process versus product-based evaluation, and then thinking about accessible or inclusive pedagogy. And then trying to pull some things together. All right, so we'll try and answer questions like how do we move beyond just thinking about cheating and cheating concerns? And then what can students do independently versus with AI? So that's going to be that zone of proximal development. And then this assessment piece, how we're actually going to assess what they've learned along the way. All right. And then by the end, hopefully be able to think about some assessment challenges as opportunities for better pedagogy. All right. So this is the first challenge. There's going to be 4 of these challenges that I'll sort of talk about. This first one is going to be authorship ambiguity, and thinking about this from lenses of like learning theory that we just discussed. And so the first thing is just a traditional view might be to say, who did the work? It's kind of a binary. Was it the student who did the work, or was it the AI that did the work, and not much in between? And there's going to be a lot of focus on detection, prevention, so detecting any use of AI, preventing students from using AI, and it can set up a very adversarial relationship, sort of like the student versus the teacher. It can kind of set up that relationship, even if it's not what you're trying to do. Right? Thinking about reframing that, so looking at it differently, maybe we think, all right, so how did learning actually happen? What kind of learning actually happened in this process of a student using AI in some way? Again, if you're thinking about this from the perspective of constructivism, then students going to be constructing their knowledge. We said it could be using other people, so that's the social constructivism idea, but also other tools. Now you're going to be focusing much more on the process and reflection. So this idea of reflection should make us think back to self-regulated learning or metacognition, right? So they have planned, they've performed the task, and now they're reflecting back on that performance. So that's where that reflection process will show up. And then there's this more of like a partnership in learning rather than like a student versus teacher. The idea is to try and shift more toward a student working with the teacher to think about their own process. The point is why I spent so long talking about self-regulated learning and metacognition is the student needs to be taking, in this kind of reframing, the student is taking a more active role in thinking about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Okay, so that's the idea there. So then that's where these principles would show up. So this forethought, student's going to be thinking, how can I use AI to help in this process? Performance as a student's going along, checking what did the AI suggest I do? Does that match my own independent work or calculation? And then reflecting, so what did I learn from this process? What worked well? What didn't work well? The example earlier with that trust bridge example was saying, all right, the student realizes there was an error in the AI calculation or the AI suggestion. So student tries to identify what may have led to that error, and then that reflection should inform their plan next time, all right? If I think this caused the error this time, what can I do the next time I'm using this AI system to have a better output or outcome and avoid that error? That's the idea. All right. On the metacognition side, it's going to be, well, can the student actually communicate to you what they did, why they did it? Do they have that level of awareness? Also, not just awareness for themselves, right? Not just that person knowledge, but also that task knowledge and knowledge about the AI system. Okay? So this gets a little tricky because it requires some awareness of how these systems work. That can be difficult, not just because the systems themselves are fairly complicated, but also because some of them are run by large corporations that don't have much of an interest in telling you how they work. Right? So there's a challenge or a struggle there as well. All right, so thinking about the implications though for assessment, now it's shifting some of the work from you all, not just did the student get the right answer, but also, and not just looking at how did they get that answer, but also how do they work with the AI to get that answer and how do I evaluate that process? So we're gonna have some discussion about like a rubric in a few minutes, not a few minutes, later on, to talk about how you might do that and approach that, but that's basically extending now what you need to actually be assessing. All right. So that was that first challenge. Second challenge, the first one was, remember, authorship with ambiguity, like the ambiguity around who's actually doing what. Second one is going to be foundational versus enhanced skills through this zone of proximal development. So it's no longer just, can the student solve this differential equation, but it's more, all right, can the student work with this AI system to help that student solve that equation? Or can the student help use this AI system to then design this bridge? So it's going to be a different kind of skill. Now, the point is not just to say don't assess the foundational skills. It's saying in addition to assessing foundational skills, now there's an additional skill set that you may want to be having your students learn. And now as part of that, you're thinking about, okay, how can I assess that piece of it? Right? So it may be the case that you revisit your learning objectives in your course, and you're saying, all right, it's not just can the student design this bridge with these specifications, but it's also can a student use this AI system to help with the design of that bridge to meet these specifications. Right? And those are two slightly different learning objectives. One's going to be more foundational skill, one's going to be the sort of enhanced skill. And now, using this backward design principle, if those are your objectives, now we're thinking about how do we assess that. All right, so on the foundational side, that's going to be that independent performance zone. Whereas on the AI-assisted side, that's going to be that zone of proximal development. So what they can do with a little assistance from tools and other resources. Right, so on the foundational side, again, core engineering principles, fundamental calculations, things that we would have been doing, you probably still do now, but were the main focus 5 years ago, let's say. This is also where you have professional judgment coming in, right? A lot of what we're doing in engineering courses is trying to help students develop that professional judgment. With the AI-assisted piece, or the assisted performance zone and zone of proximal development, now you're thinking more about complex system analysis, maybe doing some more advanced optimization and trying to use these AI tools or computational tools to help with that. Maybe you're doing some novel problem exploration, and then maybe thinking about solution generation and solution exploration. Right? Oops. All right, cool. So now on the assessment side, again, now you need to be pulling in how is the student actually interacting with that AI system. And as I mentioned with the constructivism and zone of proximal development is this notion of scaffolding. So how do you build around the support structure to help students engage and work through those different tasks? Here, you can think about this a number of ways. One way is to think about different skill levels. So moving from novice, where there's a heavy AI use, to developing maybe more structured approach, to a proficient, and then eventually expert. So you can kind of think about this as different levels. You can call these different things, but the whole point is you're moving from, as a student's developing, you're moving the amount of scaffolding or the amount of support that you're having students do. So you may have this in like a first or second year course where you give a student, problem one, but there's problem one, part A, part B, part C. And in each step, you're trying to helping the student walk through. But maybe in a third year or fourth year course, you're not doing as much scaffolding. You're just giving the student that problem, and they need to figure out, okay, what are the steps that I need to walk through? Now, the idea here is to try and use assessments that are appropriate for that different level of scaffolding, and for both that independence zone and also that assistance zone. So the independence zone is going to be without AI. That might look like having in-class assignments or in-class assessments much more. That way you can be a little more confident that students aren't actually using AI systems. And that's in contrast with the assisted zone, where there is going to be that AI use, but the key here is with documentation. Then the challenge, of course, is now you've got a lot more documentation to look through, and also how you're going to grade that, which, again, we'll talk about strategies for that in a few minutes. It's like the same slide. Okay, that was challenge 2. So that was foundational skills versus these enhanced skills. Now, this is challenge 3, but you could also think about this as an extension from challenge 2, which is going to be process versus product. And this is going to be through the lens of self-regulated learning. So that's what that SRL is standing for. All right. So here, you're going to be looking at students' process of actually solving a problem. And you're going to be asking them to engage in this planning phase, this forethought phase, and then that reflection phase. So that's what you're going to have students do. Forethought, you're asking students to plan, all right, these are the steps I need to take. This is how I'm setting up the problem. This is what I know. This is what I don't know. These are the steps I think I need to proceed through. So you have strategic planning, again, this self-efficacy. So how well does a student think that they are going to be able to engage in this task and solve this problem? That gets back to this person knowledge. What do they know about themselves and their own abilities? And then task analysis accuracy. And then performance, right? So performance is going to be as they're actually going along, they're monitoring themselves. Now you can do this different ways, right? So if it's a scenario where you have problem 1, but it's problem 1A, problem 1B, problem 1C, then you can have them doing some monitoring at each stage of that. You also have them doing some reflection. So if they have finished 1A, and they are now reflecting on how they did for that, you could then have them plan, all right, how am I going to do 1B? So you could have these smaller cycles of self-regulated learning within that, or you could just have them reflect at the end, or do that monitoring at the end, but that's what that's going to look like. The big thing here, though, is trying to have them document that like in real time. So what sometimes is a convenient way to do is just have them, if you have students working through a problem on their piece of paper, just have them make a little column on the side where they're actually just making notes. Okay, here's Here's why I'm doing this step. Here's why I'm making this calculation, and so on. And that's them monitoring their activity. Then they get to the end of the page. That reflection, I think, lots of times, the phrase that I use a lot is like the sanity check. So you get your answer at the end. You then think, right, does this make sense? Does it make sense that I have a flow rate of 1 million cubic feet per second? Probably not, right? So it's that level of just quick check and reflecting on yourself as well. But of course, reflection is more than just that. It's all right, how did I get this problem? What do these steps do? Does this make sense? And what I usually do, and so on, right? Right. Challenge 4 is going to be around accessible and inclusive pedagogy. And here is just a few different principles that we didn't quite have time to talk about, but I think are important to just keep in mind. So one is around universal design for learning, which is going to be thinking about different means of representation. So some students might understand concepts to mention, explained one way versus explained a different way. So for my favorite instance of this, Antonio mentioned earlier, he was using an analogy when talking about backward design, or maybe it's more of a metaphor. He was using a metaphor when talking about backward design and thinking about like a staircase, right? I imagine most people have been on staircases. So we're in this auditorium, so you probably have. But if you're making a metaphor that is not accessible to everyone, so if I started using a metaphor about things in Texas, about, let's say, a rodeo in Texas, that's probably not going to be as accessible to you all, right? So that would be sort of against this idea or this principle of universal design for learning. There's lots of other ways that manifests, but that might be one. Then there's this cultural historical activity theory, which we're not going to spend too much time on, because I did want to mention self-determination theory. So I've already used language around self-regulated learning, self-efficacy. Those are concepts that will show up in motivation. Another one is self-determination theory. So this is another theory about motivation and how or why people engage in certain tasks. And under the self-determination theory, there's basically these 3 principles. So autonomy, competence, and then relatedness. So autonomy is basically how much agency or how much independence does somebody have to choose what they're going to do. So with AI, how much choice does a student have in how they're going to use AI, which tools they're going to use. Competence is going to be how successful do they think they'll be. So how good are they at using it? And then relatedness is going to be talking about more this community support. So the community that you've built in your classroom, which will then tie back to this idea of social constructivism. So the point is, you can think about these principles as you're designing your own course to help build your students' a sense of autonomy. So rather than telling students, this is exactly how you need to, this is exactly the tool you need to use, this is exactly how you need to use it, you can build in some more flexibility so that they have more choice. The idea here is that increased level of choice increases their autonomy, that increases their motivation, and that sort of increases their drive to engage in the class. Same thing with, so that was the autonomy, same thing with competence. So you start helping build up their skill level in engaging in that task, so using AI for that process that they're working on. And as they keep building up that competence, that is, the more competent or the more able I feel in being able to engage in that task, I'm more likely to engage in it again and again. So you scaffold this by saying, all right, we're going to help you walk through how to use AI this time. Next time, I'm not going to help you as much. The time after that, less. So, right? So you're moving that scaffolding. Ideally, students are building up their competence along the way. And finally, that relatedness. So the idea is just we're all engaged. Education for most people is a social activity. So trying to build that sense of community in students' classes, helping them feel like they have that sense of belonging. Right? So that's that third part of it. And then this growth mindset. So who's heard of this phrase, growth mindset? So there's going to be growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. Right? So fixed mindset is going to be more like, I think I have these abilities, and either I have them or I don't, and there's not much I can do to fix that or change that. Growth mindset is going to be more, I don't have this ability yet, but I can change that and get better. So a lot of this work comes out of the 90s. There's lots of research on those areas. But the point is to try and help your students develop that growth mindset. Maybe I'm not currently good at using AI tools. That does not mean I will never be good at using AI tools. I just need to have some scaffolded experiences, build up that competence, develop some sense of autonomy and this higher sense of self-efficacy, and then eventually I have better skills, and because I have this growth mindset, I'm more likely to engage in that whole process. One thing I just want to note is that in this growth mindset way of thinking about things, mistakes are not bad. They're, you know, you reframe it as like, it is an opportunity to develop, it's an opportunity to learn. And so a lot of this original research came out of this idea that when you're grading, so when you're grading your students' work, do you just make a big X and give it a F, or do you say not yet? So what they found was that when you would grade students' work and just not, instead of saying F, or like 5 out of 10, if you were to use language more like not yet, needs improvement, things like that, that led to more of this growth mindset, which led to students actually improving more over time because they had that process or that mentality of, all right, I just need to work, I just need to try again, as opposed to, I didn't get it right and I'm never going to get it right. All right, so and again, it's another figure to tie all this together, which is going to be more useful when you actually have the PDF, but that's just tying these different theories together and talking about it as it relates to those four core assessment challenges. So those four are along that top row, and then just talking about those different theories and how they show up here. All right, so that's the end of block 2. Now we're just talking about reframing, okay? So we talked about the authorship, the skills, that sort of foundational versus enhanced. We talked about some evaluation for evaluating both process and product, and then talked about a little bit about accessibility and just different mentalities. What we're going to do now, though, is this third, all right? So we're currently at 310. This is the part where, so I don't know if you all have these. I'm sure you do. It's a very common child, okay, so I have a 3-year-old son, and it's a very common type of book to have a choose your own adventure book. Right? So do you all have these kinds of things, like a choose your own adventure, where the book is going along up until a certain, let's say, page 30, and then at page 30, you can take path A, or you can take path B, or you can take path C, and you're choosing your own adventure. Okay, so this is the choose your own adventure part of the lecture, okay? So we've made it to about an hour, because we started around 2:10, and it is currently 3:10. Antonio told me that we have 2 hours together. So we can keep going. We can take a quick break to have a discussion. We can take a quick break to stand up. I don't know if you're like me, but after 20 minutes of sitting, I want to get up. So after an hour, I really want to get up. But we have a few different options here. Okay? So I'm going to pause. I'm going to turn to Antonio first, because he's going to probably have a better feel for what is good. But also, if anyone has any preferences, we can entertain those as well.
What they are saying is that they, in fact, oh, yeah. Do you want some water?
Oh, no,
Just to
no, thanks.
refresh, let's
Yeah,
say?
no, no, that's a good question. No, thank you. No, that's very nice. No, I'm fine.
It was my fault, I think.
No, this is great.
Sorry.
No, so the problem is I love talking. I mean, I'm in an engineering education program, right? So I love talking about this.
But what they told me is that they want to use the backward design, or in fact go back to some of your points and discuss some of your points.
Yeah. Yes.
And just to point out, another question is that how do you think, in a very specific way, AI can contribute to reduce the lack that we have when the students come from high school?
Yeah. Okay, so and when you say lack, did you say lack?
Lack.
Yeah.
Yeah, the gap.
Yeah. And the gap in their understanding of
Yeah,
certain
yeah.
things. Okay. Yeah. Oh, wait. No, too much. This one, yes.
I'm lost.
Yeah. So I'll go back further, but
One more.
Uh-huh.
Perhaps. I'm not sure.
so we started here and said we'll cover, and then there were those 4 challenges. So we started here, then we went, here's what we'll cover, so, and then we went to challenge 1, which was that authorship. And we talked about the traditional view. It might also be easier to read off the TV, actually. Is that any easier?
Yes.
Should I go forward one more?
One forward, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is this here?
Yeah.
I'm not sure
Yeah.
that I'm able to understand the expression
Mm-hmm.
to construct knowledge.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you please
Yeah.
develop that idea?
Yes. Okay. So to construct knowledge, all right, so I'm going to explain this in contrast with some other principles or theories. And Mitch, I'm going to start with behaviorism, because in my head, there's behaviorism, then cognitivism, and then constructivism. Yeah? Okay. So, yes, to explain this idea of constructivism, I'm going to explain a little bit more, like, where does this come from so what was a different way of thinking about people learning, like how people learn before constructivism? Because that'll set up maybe different ways. Okay, so behaviorism might be one of the more older ways of thinking about how people learn, or how anything learns. All right, so behaviorism, has anyone heard this, that term a little bit? Okay, so behaviorism is going to be basically tied with ideas of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. The idea is if you engage in certain activities, how you're rewarding that activity. Activities that get more reward, you're more likely to engage in. Less likely, get punished, less likely to engage in. So that was this idea of behaviorism. So it was really just based on this reward signal back to people. That's not a very there's not a very active process in learning for the learner, like for the student, right? It's really just what's the signal that they got back, and that's it. So the idea is, well, we can be more actively engaged in how we learn. Like we can be more thoughtful about how we're learning. Also, we may not always get a reward signal back. So how do you explain how people learn in those situations where there is no direct reward signal? You also have problems of like delayed reward signals. So, for example, a student may take a test. It may take 2 weeks to get that grade back, or like it may take a week to get that grade back. Well, that's that reward signal, but it's just one grade, so maybe it doesn't tell them a whole lot about that actual process. So there's lots of issues that come up with that reward-based way of thinking about learning. And also, like I said, we can be more reflective in how we're learning. So it's that process of like reflection and deliberately thinking, what do I know, what do I not know, how do I make sense of this? That's going to be called constructing. That's going to be like the constructing process when you're constructing knowledge. And that's what this is referring to when thinking about constructivism. Mitch, you have anything you want to add?
I would just say briefly that a big idea in constructivism is the individuality of knowledge. That we all have different knowledge, we've all constructed it differently, and we all can recall our own knowledge differently depending on our interpretations of a situation. So for you to construct knowledge requires a situation demands your knowledge be recalled and then added to meet the demands of that situation. So something to think about from the constructivist standpoint would be, how is it that I am engaging students, recalling their previous knowledge, and how am I then building on that previous knowledge with whatever we're trying to do in class? So it's really trying to focus on each person having their own understanding, and that understanding is theirs alone, and unknown to you.
Thanks, Mitch. Does that help a little bit with describing what that means there with constructing knowledge? Cool. Yeah. All right. I guess I'm going to choose your adventure for you. Okay. So what we'll do, we'll go on to the next bit. What I think would be great is if there are specific... No, let's do this a different way. You all are doing me an honor by being here, right? You're attending a talk that I'm giving. That's great. Thank you. But something probably drove you to be here. So you probably care about your students, how you're learning. You probably have some issues that you're facing in class. I'm curious and I'm interested in knowing that. So what's driven you all here? And the reason I think I want to ask that question before we go on is because that might then help me figure out what to talk about for the next few minutes. So what we'll do, and I'll pause on this slide, but I'd like at least a couple of people to just mention or tell me, why are you here? You know, like in this auditorium at 3:20. I mean, some of you all presumably came through bad weather to get here, right? Yeah. So now you had an extra hurdle. Okay, so can you tell me why? What are some of the reasons that you're here today? Sure. Just rain. Yeah, okay, great.
I want to know how to use EI to do effective teaching learning process.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay, so you're interested in like the is that teaching and learning and also like the assessment piece, or more on the like teaching and learning side? More for teaching and learning?
Okay, the assessment too.
Thanks. Someone else, please.
Hi. I think LLMs are an amazing tool, and I do use them from time to time. But I'm deeply worried that our students will choose to use them before they are able to critically assess what they are providing, the information that they are providing, and so they will simply not learn.
Thank you.
We think that the reasoning process from the students is slow.
Yep.
And with EI is fast. And how to improve the teaching and learning process with this changing of paradigm.
Thank you. And then, yeah.
So that and that, but and this rapidly knowledge that they have, how do they retain it? Because retention, this is what they retain. That's what we are aiming to, right? Okay, now you know that, but what about tomorrow? What about in a few weeks? What about in a few years?
Yeah.
How do we work with that?
Okay. All right. Okay. Good. All right. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to keep going through some of these, and some of the slides. I think that will address, or at least give us an opportunity to talk more about some of those issues. So the student skill side, the retention side. Antonio mentioned earlier about helping students fill like a gap. So we'll try and make sure we touch on those or discuss those as we go forward. Right? All right, so this is the third block. This is going to be, so the change management is going to be more thinking about faculty and if you're trying to do something in your department. I haven't really heard too much concern about that yet, so we may not want to spend much time on that. But this binary to spectrum thinking might be a more useful place for us to spend time, and so we'll probably go there. There is this change theory management framework, though, for these 8 steps. So if you are interested in leading in your department in some way, so you're thinking, oh, we need to change our assessment strategies, this is a set of steps to help think through that. Of course, there's many change management strategies that you can use, so this is just one example, and it basically has these 8 steps. So the first 4 steps are just around creating a climate for change, and then the next 4 steps are going to be more about actually getting people to engage in that change and enabling them to change, right? I'm going to put these here, as I've mentioned several times. Think of this more as future reference when you actually have the slides and thinking through those steps. If anyone is interested in how do you think about faculty change management, then we can spend more time later on. But for now, again, think of this as like future reference. Again, those first 4, creating some sense of urgency. I don't think anyone needs help with that part. But building a coalition is another sort of strategy that you use. Developing a vision for what some change could look like. Communicating that, that's that first 4 steps. And now you're actually going to work on empowering action. So giving small wins, giving small steps toward progress. Then you're going to kind of keep that progress going, so you go from one thing to the next. I mean, this looks very similar to when we're talking about the student development, zone of proximal development, right? Start with what you can do, build out from there, have some scaffolding, make small wins, sort of keep the momentum going, and the idea is you kind of go from a small pilot to a larger pilot. Now that's just in your class. Now you do this in 2 classes and sort of build momentum from there. That's the idea. Okay. All right, so we'll move on from this right now, but this is just some steps that you might want to go through. Okay, and those are just thinking about where your department might be, with those 8 steps, let's say. All right, so here's some instances of faculty concerns, and actually I do think we heard a little bit of some of these. So some common concerns that I hear would be this lowers academic standards a little bit. So, and that gets to this idea of maybe shifting from foundational skills to higher order thinking. Now this gets to the problem that was mentioned earlier, but if students don't develop those skills to begin with, how are they going to engage in that higher order thinking? One way to do this is to use another framework around self-regulated learning and self-regulation that starts with like observation, then emulation. So the idea is have students observe good AI use behavior, or have students observe good reasoning, good instances of reasoning. Then once they've done that observation, then they emulate. So emulate would be like copying. So they copy that kind of behavior. So in the classroom, this might look like you demonstrating good or proper use of AI for some task in your class. They are observing that. Then you have them copy that same behavior, so that's emulation. And then this next step is going to be, well, now they do it themselves without needing to just copy you, but they also do it on like a new task that they have not seen yet. And that's going to be another progression that you can help students go through. So when it comes to just developing the reasoning skills, the idea is, okay, good. You pull up an example of using AI in your class for solving some skill. You talk out loud through, this is what I see the AI doing. This is where it's doing it well. This is where it's not doing it well. So now you're basically modeling or demonstrating that behavior of critically engaging with AI tools. And then as you're doing that, The idea is students should be observing. Now, if you want to make sure students are observing, you can have them deliberately writing down their observations and turning that into a small assessment to make sure that they're actually observing, observing well. And then you turn that into an exercise where now you give them something similar to do, have them use that AI tool, and now they do that whole process of reflection that you were demonstrating. They do that themselves. So that's one way to do that. Now that's the same. So now in the middle left column says students won't learn fundamentals. So that here is you can still have these AI restricted assessments. And this is where we end up seeing a lot more of in-class assessments compared to what we used to do. So it was, I don't know about here, but it was way more common to give students assignments to take home for homework. Now you see more of a shift to doing things in class, and that's the way to try and assess, okay, can students actually do this without AI assistance? Now that they have that sort of fundamental skill that you've observed or tried to assess, now let them use AI, and you bake in certain ways of using AI intentionally. And we'll talk about that. Like I said, that can be sort of like the process and product. So the way I think about this is like AI restricted, AI enhanced, so you let them use AI in some way to help them with that, and then you give them some new kind of assignment or new assessment that really is supposed to be using AI more, and now they need to basically be reflecting, I guess the term might be editing or acting like a critic of the AI output. So that is, they go from demonstrating, yes, they can do something on their own, now they can do something with AI, now they have the AI output, and now they need to basically judge or like evaluate that AI output. And the idea is, as they've gone through that, that kind of requires higher level thinking because they need to have that ability to critique what that output was. So that's the idea there. It's too much work to redesign everything. It's like a third example of like possible feedback or critiques that you might get. And this gets back to that change management theory of just starting with small pilots and then scaffolding from there. It also gets back to this idea of like having communities of practice. So to the extent that you can, working with faculty, not just in your department, but other departments as well. Because something that might work, that someone thought to do in their class, might also translate or transfer to your course as well. So you can do that. There's other sort of resistance factors on the right, but to get to some actual examples, I want to keep us moving. Okay. Right. So I wanted to have a quick show of hands to ask which best describes your current approach to AI in assessment. And you could say more than one of these, but I'm kind of curious to see. So the 5 options, I'll read these out, and then I'll go back and ask for a show of hands. Right? So the question is, which best describes your current approach to AI in assessment? Right? And question 1, so the first one is detection focus. So trying to prevent or detect AI use. Second one is avoidance, so ignoring the AI issue entirely. Third one is experimentation, so trying different approaches. Fourth option is documentation, so that's requiring AI use transparency. And then the fifth one is integration, so systematically incorporating AI literacy. And so those are the 5 options. I'm curious to see or to hear which one of these I wrote best describes your current approach, but it can be more than one of these. So it's really just which of these describe your approach to AI in assessment. So the first one, show of hands, trying to prevent or detect AI use. So a couple people, not too much, though. That's interesting. All right, second one, avoidance. So just ignoring the issue entirely. Experimentation, so trying different approaches. Documentation, so requiring AI use transparency. And then integration, so systematically incorporating AI literacy throughout. All right, cool. All right, that's helpful as well. So this is the recap for that third block. We're going to go on to now some more practical strategies that hopefully you can find ways to implement in your own course, right? So this is going to be this assessment-aligned framework for redesigning courses. All right, so here, what we'll talk about is progressive complexity. We've already talked about this idea of moving from novice to developing to proficient to expert. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Being intentional about integrating self-regulation. Like a bit of a guide for approaching assessment selection, and then maybe a decision tree for implementation. And then we'll have practical models with examples, right? So this is probably the most practical or like applied part or block of the talk. So we'll try and ask, how do students progress in AI literacy? Which assessment approach fits maybe your context? How to scaffold student development? And then what does implementation kind of look like in any of this? Okay. Some of this is coming from theories around expertise development. So the idea here is going to be that students are going to progress from predictable stages through predictable stages, starting from novice to expert. And what we're trying to do here is help students progress along. So a novice AI user may follow prescribed AI interaction patterns, as I mentioned earlier. Maybe you tell students, here's the tool you need to use, here's how you use it. You have basic prompts with guidance for students, and student accepts AI outputs, maybe, right? That's going to be like the novice version. We're going to try and quickly move from that. But assessment can focus on just the process documentation with templates, right? That's like a very sort of basic place to maybe start if you're trying to help students think about how to use AI in your specific course. Then after novice is going to be developing, so a developing AI user. Now you're going to have maybe some structured prompts for routine tasks, but you're going to have them work on recognizing AI limitations. So the task is not just accept what the AI has generated as output, but try and identify where there are some limitations in that output. You offer students some basic verification strategies, so maybe some ways to check the AI output. And then you're focusing now on this comparative piece. So students need to compare what they think the output should be with what the AI output actually was. So now they're moving from just can they use the AI to now can they try and assess or evaluate the AI output in some way. Third one is going to be that proficient AI user. So there's going to be, all right, they need to now be intentionally thinking about how are they going to interact with the AI system. This is where you start to pull in some of that self-regulation and thinking about the planning phase, right? So students, you're no longer giving students templates of how to interact with the AI. You're no longer telling them, here's exactly the tool to use. You are instead telling students, you need to come up with a plan for how you will use AI, and then you need to come up with a plan for how you will evaluate that output, and they actually need to do that evaluation. Okay, now they've moved from like a little bit of critique to much more critique of that AI evaluation. And they're doing this reflection piece as well. So they've not only planned and evaluated that AI output, but now they're reflecting, they're thinking, all right, here's why it was wrong. No, here's where it was wrong. And here's why I think it was wrong. So here's how that AI made that mistake. Finally, you have this expert AI user. Now they are thinking, now basically you're no longer even giving them the task to do. You're like the specific task, like a very general task. It goes to the same example that I gave earlier when talking about scaffolding. You're no longer saying for part 1A, solve this, then for part 1B, solve this. You are instead saying, here's question 1, you need to design the whole process. This means that in order to do that design, they need to be able to anticipate and where the AI is going to have limitations and figure out ways to address those limitations. And ideally, they're going to work on creating some novel solutions, use AI in ways that will, again, avoid those limitations and really focus on what the AI system can do well. And there is a bit of a meta-learning aspect to this approach because they need to think about how they're thinking about the system, how the AI system thinks about what that task is, and so on. So there's a meta-learning piece to this as well. Now, on the bottom, I've been skipping over this, but on the bottom, there are these engineering-specific examples. So for this expert AI user, the example down here is that a student develops novel AI-assisted design methodology, documents those limitations, and creates verification protocols for professional use. So that's what like that expert user example would look like. And as I mentioned, there have been these other examples as well that I just didn't state. Okay, so those 4 phases went from novice was the process documentation. Then there was the developing, which was sort of AI restricted components, and the comparative analysis piece, and then there's critical evaluation. So tying this back to self-regulated learning, right? We have this forethought phase, the performance phase, and then the reflection phase, and this is kind of how those connect together. So if you wanted to be explaining to students, hey, here's the principle that we're using for why I am giving you this comparison exercise, this AI comparison exercise, for example, right? Here's how you would tie in those ideas. And this comes back to what I've been saying in terms of planning, monitoring what they're doing, reflecting on what they're doing, so that the next time they make a plan, they can improve. That's what that would look like in practice. All right. So I was mapping the self-regulated learning part, and you've helped students move from novice with guided templates, structured performance documentation, to more of that expert approach. So they're doing their own goal setting, they're monitoring that performance. Now, in my mind, and I think typically this evolves over the course of multiple semesters, and this is where it becomes a challenge, because to do that, you need to be collaborating with more than just yourself, right? You need to be collaborating across multiple courses, usually in your department and so on. And that's why we had that discussion, or at least those slides, about change management. The idea being you're going to need to advocate for some kind of change amongst multiple faculty members. Right. What I want to do is, okay, that's the decision, that's fine. Talk about a rubric real quick. Because we've talked a little bit about maybe some different approaches to your courses, thinking about learning objectives and maybe some assessments, but that's been a little generic. But these, no, practical models first. Okay. These are going to be the specific assessments that I had in mind. So a scaffolded assessment using a pyramid approach, comparative analysis, documentation-based reflective practice, and then talking about ways to think about that. Okay. All right. This is going to use that scaffolding theory that I mentioned earlier, which is going to connect to this idea of zone of proximal development. The idea being provide some temporary structures to help students along the way. So give them lots of small steps, tell them what to do, then over time remove that assistance systematically. All right. So the idea here, you're going to have some core competencies that you're going to try and assess. This gets back to this idea of you need to establish foundational knowledge to begin with. So it's not really trying to replace that. It's saying do that, and then on top of that, now let's have some additional skills that you're trying to help students develop. So those core competencies, independently demonstrating knowledge, that's going to typically happen in classes. That's the way that you can make sure that students aren't really assessing or accessing AI. You can give them assignments to take home, but now you're relying on them to say, no, I'm not using AI. And some students will will not use AI, but some students may. So in class is still going to be what we're going to try and do. And now you're looking at these basic problem-solving skills without AI, as we may have done 5 years ago. Second one is this guided practice. So now structure AI interaction with documentation. You've given them students, hey, do task A, here's what you need to document. Do task B, here's what you need to document. And then you start to have this thing where you say, all right, instead of doing that, you can give students that AI output already. So you can give students AI output to a problem, then tell students, all right, the better way to do this is say, give students a problem to work on. They work on that problem. Then you give students the AI-based solution to that problem. Then you say, all right, where are there differences between your approach and this AI approach? And in doing that, you will need to also know where did the AI approach work well, not work well, where are their limitations, and that way you can make sure that a student understands how to make that comparison themselves. So that would be that comparative analysis that I'm talking about. Third is going to be more of a critique. So instead of them just first solving the problem and then doing that comparison with an AI approach that you gave them, instead, you give them that AI approach, and now they just need to be critiquing it, which means they probably need to solve it themselves, but the trick here is going to be the the temptation to just do what the AI did. So they need to have that awareness to be able to say, all right, I can't just do what the AI did. So I have a colleague at another university. They intentionally made a bad chatbot. They intentionally basically trained a large language model to be maybe like 70% accurate with helping students with, this was in a chemical engineering department. So they trained it to be maybe like 70% accurate on when students would ask it a question for homework. And the whole point of this exercise was to encourage students to develop that critical analysis approach, to not just instinctively or automatically trust the AI output because it was AI output. And so that's the kind of exercise that we're talking about here, where the student needs to take the AI output, and I think a lot of us have an instinct to just take it as true, which, again, like I think that's a fairly normal instinct sometimes, but also like it's a skill to stop and pause and think, no, I need to think for myself here. So the point is like this critical application is what we're talking about to help students develop that skill. Okay, so not to make this like a huge thing, but right, this happens in lots of settings. Anytime there's an authority who's making some sort of statement, right, I think a lot of us have a tendency to just say, yeah, that sounds right. And of course, that's how you end up with critical thinking skills being an important part of what we're teaching students. Okay, and this last one is this professional integration. Okay, so second model is comparative analysis with metacognitive scaffolding. So thinking back to metacognition and this metacognitive framework, that was thinking about both the sort of metacognitive knowledge and then metacognitive regulation. And then metacognitive knowledge had this idea of person knowledge, task knowledge, and then strategy knowledge. So knowledge about themselves, knowledge about the task, knowledge about how to solve the task. Okay, so what that looks like here, metacognitive planning, students need to think, what do I already know about this problem type? What are my goals in addressing this problem? How will I evaluate success? Then you can have them do this dual problem solving where they are like intentionally engaging in those different metacognitive steps. And then as they're going along, they're making adaptations to their approaches. So as I mentioned earlier, this kind of looks like them having a separate column on their problem sheet when they're working, where they're making notes to themselves. Then at the end, they're thinking, okay, which approach worked, didn't work, why is that? What did they learn about their own thinking process? This gets back to that person knowledge. And how did AI maybe change my problem-solving approach? And then when I do this in the future, what would I do differently? So that gets to that reflection and then that planning piece. Then just very practically, okay, if you're going to do that, what might be a breakdown of the actual grade? So you could do this kind of thing where you say, all right, 25% is just their traditional solution accuracy, maybe 25% is the AI-assisted solution quality, then maybe you have 30% for like how do they actually do that comparison, and then maybe some metacognitive reflection. So if you wanted to try and implement this kind of approach where you're having much more than just solve the problem, but also here's a scaffolded way to engage in this metacognitive activity, here's how you might break that down grade-wise. All right, so there's this notion of reflection in action and reflection on action, which is going to sound very similar. It's kind of like a different way of thinking about the self-regulation piece. Because it's going to sound very similar, I'm not going to stop and think here, but if you're interested in this idea of having students actively think through the process as they're working, this might be another approach that you could take. So it's one of those left as an exercise for the readers kind of thing. Model 3 is a documentation-based reflective practice. So that's kind of what the timeline might look like if you were trying to do this. So moving from reflection in practice as they're actually working, they're documenting, then reflection on practice, so after they're finished, and then reflection for action, so thinking forward, how are they going to plan? Oops. Right. I'm skipping through so we can get to the rubric piece, because this is just like, all all right, very practically, if you're actually trying to grade any of this, what are you going to do? Okay, so there is these different levels, as I mentioned, novice, developing, proficient, expert. You might be interested in cognitive characteristics, observable behaviors, or like assessment evidence. And so this is a table that is designed to help you think about, all right, if I'm trying to assess, let's say, the novice, like where they are in this novice, developing, proficient, expert, you might say, all right, the observable behaviors are just going to be, can they follow prescribed prompts, or can they adapt prompts to their context, or can they design new prompts, or can they design an entirely new approach? So that was me reading through that middle column there. And then the idea is you can then assign points, using that kind of rubric for your assignments. And that's using that same sort of framework of, all right, you've got these 4 stages for expertise development. Now, if you're trying to think about like this sort of competency for like criticality, like thinking critically, this is what that might look like. So different stages for metacognitive knowledge, regulation, assessment, and how those might map to these 4 stages. The idea here is really just if you're thinking about doing this in your own classes, and you're thinking about what does the novice level look like, what does the developing level look like, what is proficient, what is expert, like these are some ways to think about that, from the metacognitive knowledge perspective, the regulation perspective, and so on. So just trying to give you some general framework for thinking about your own class. Then you might be interested in not just the metacognitive piece, but like this prompt engineering piece, trying to measure those 4 levels. That's what this might look like. And then there's another skill that we'll get to instead of prompt engineering. Maybe you're going to think about this not just from the prompt engineering, so it really was just those 3 skills, but now I wanted to mention briefly this idea of formative assessment and summative assessment. So who's familiar with this idea of like formative assessment and summative assessment? All right, so the idea here, you'll often hear this paraphrased or rephrased as assessment for learning or assessment of learning. So assessment for learning, formative assessment. The idea is you're going to have lower stakes assessments that are designed to help students learn. That's sort of like a quicker feedback loop for students to help them in their development process, whereas assessment of learning is more at the end. Here's how they did. So it's often associated with like exams, final exams at the end of their semester, big kind of higher stakes assessments. And then the point is, you can think about that, assessing AI literacy, both on the formative assessment side, so having regular check-ins on their AI interaction quality, peer feedback on their documentation analysis. That would also tie back to this social construction idea. Self-assessment, so that's going to get a little bit to this metacognitive piece. Or you can think about it from the summative assessment side. So they develop a portfolio of AI-enhanced work, comprehensive project integrations, things like this. So it's a bigger scale usually, and it's usually at the end of semesters, things like this. All right. So that was a lot of random strategies for like the last hour and a half. It was a lot of me talking first about self-regulated learning, metacognition, backward design principles, all right, those are the learning objectives, how are we going to get there, talking a lot about here's some different strategies for thinking about AI and AI use. You're trying to use these in assessments, all right, how exactly are you going to integrate it? Are you just going to give students a prompt or some sort of specific directions? Why might that be good? How do you scaffold that and remove that scaffolding and so on? Talked about that with regards to constructivism, talk about this zone of proximal development, right? Here's what they can do, here's what they can do with assistance, help them move in that developmental trajectory, and then skipped through a bunch of slides because there was more material than we could get through. So that is, as you can guess, there's probably more slides here, but we're not going to do that. So instead, what we're going to do for the last, let's say, 10, 15 minutes, however long people want to stay seated, is just have a discussion. So I have a lot of thoughts that are not in these slides about approaches to assessments, thinking about AI use in specific ways. I use AI in my research, so my research is focused on how to characterize mental models that students have or that engineers have of various processes. And those can be very like just purely physical processes, like a mental model a student has of current in a wire, let's say. Or it can be much larger mental models of social, ecological, technological systems and how those systems interact with each other and how that then informs their design decisions. So my interest is in how do you characterize mental models that students have, and then how does that inform the decisions that they make. So I'm interested in like mental models and decision making. Point is, to do that kind of work at a large scale, you need a lot of qualitative data. So you need a lot of text, right? Students talking out loud as they're engaged in design tasks, students answering open-ended questions. You ask a student, why did you make this specific design decision? And now you just get them talking. But of course, as you have all that text, and if you have big engineering classes, how are you going to grade all that? So I spend a lot of time thinking about how do you help use large language models with analyzing that kind of text. Point of saying that is that I end up using language models a lot. So I have a lot of thoughts just in general about what they're good at, what they're not good at, ways to use them well and not well. So I'm going to pause here, see what is on your mind, whether that's, can you go back to this slide to explain this idea, or I had this thought about this class, what can I do, or I'm observing this student behavior, like anything would be great for discussion. So I'll pause here and then really just open the floor. I guess I can hold on to this microphone and I guess Antonio can circulate as people have thoughts or ideas, but that's probably a good place to pause for now.
Querem fazer algumas observações, perguntas? Eu acho que ele, não sei se ele abordou aquela pergunta que você falou, não, né? I asked the Achilles if you can tell a little bit more about the idea of bridging the gap. Yeah.
So this was this idea of a student comes in. I think earlier you were talking about math. There's like students' math levels, and maybe some. Gotcha. And is this? And so the idea is more of AI as almost like a tutor in some ways. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about? Gotcha. Okay, so here the way I think about this is that you can do a few different things. One is helping students, and this all comes back to this idea of like modeling behavior for students, that they learn how to interact with these systems. Because some students, they'll just interact with these systems. They'll have a good sense of how to use these systems, what works, what doesn't work, what's a good prompting strategy. But many students may not know that, right? There's better ways or worse ways to interact with these systems. What they output is very much dependent on what the input is. So in this case, my usual thought is, first is like that metacognitive knowledge of like their person knowledge. So helping students think about what is it that they know and don't know. So are you all familiar with this, the Dunning-Kruger effect? Have you all ever heard of this? Have people heard of this? So it's this idea of trying to, so imagine like a two-dimensional axis, or like a vertical axis and horizontal axis. On the horizontal axis is someone's actual competency, like their actual competence level. On the vertical axis is their perceived competence level. And the idea is what you see is that people who have a very low level of competency, they get a little bit more competency and think they're really good at it. But then as you keep getting better and better, you start to realize all of the things you don't know. So the curve kind of goes up, it goes up like this, and then starts to come down, and then eventually it comes back up, but it takes a while to get there. So the point is, this is one challenge for sure. It's just on the metacognitive knowledge piece. Because students who don't know much, they don't know what they don't know. So they may think, oh yeah, no, I'm pretty good at this. So I think my thought with this is always step one, helping students know, so do that self-assessment piece. And like have that honest like reflection, what they know and don't know. So you can have, maybe there's a role for AI in that. I tend to think that's not a huge place where you need AI. Like there's a lot more that you can do just to help students get to that self-knowledge part. Or the next piece is that does come in with AI is, okay, good. Now once they know, have some self-knowledge of where they are, then it's okay. How can we scaffold those experiences for using AI so they can move from where they are to where you want them to be? And there, I think it's still the sort of thing where you build in these kinds of self-regulated learning practices of saying, all right, I'm trying to learn about a first-order differential equation. And here's the things I know, here's the things I don't know, move along, and give them that scaffolding. Okay, if they don't know how to interact with AI systems, maybe you're providing them prompts. Now we're talking about that sort of moving them from novice to developing the proficient to expert, except you're helping them with this AI literacy skill along the way. And I think it's always just how intentional, how specific can you be with them, especially if it's because it's mostly first, are we thinking like first year students primarily? Yeah. So there's also just this developmental piece of like, they're learning how to interact with these systems, just how to be good, effective students to begin with. So there's this whole other set of skills that I usually think come along with this, beyond just, yeah, they need to be better at solving these different, or these integrals. So that's kind of how I think about it. The problem is, that's more than just what you usually cover in a math class. So that kind of gets to what you were talking about this morning. So Antonio was talking to me about this sort of curricular integration that they have. And there's I forget what we said, it was like planning, it wasn't planning, I said it was like project management, but you said it was like self-management. So it's like a self-management piece to this as well. So it's kind of like learning how to learn is also that skill that I think we don't always help students develop, but I think that is probably more core to some of this. The idea being, once they've learned how to learn, once they've had to be more intentional, more sort of self-reflective, how to engage in these cycles, then now they can be thinking more, how can I use AI to help me with that process? And you can scaffold it to say, help students think, all right, I need to plan how I'm going to use AI to help me learn about, again, how to solve this closed integral or something. Anyways, that's like one thought.
And in AI itself, you think it can be used as during the progress of the student to learn something, for instance, not only to realize that he doesn't or she doesn't know, and should think better.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and this is one thing that you see a lot of interest in from the larger tech companies. So for example, I know OpenAI currently rolls out a version of this, same with Google with their, I think it's called LM Classroom or something. But they are being very intentional now about figuring out ways to have a language model have some kind of like memory of you to try and understand what kinds of examples you prefer, what kinds of life experiences you have, going to what we were saying earlier. Because once it has that sort of like knowledge of you, it will be better able to make examples, explanations, things like this. So for example, I know Ricardo likes an okay football team in Curitiba. So maybe when I'm trying to explain something to Ricardo, I'm going to use an analogy that makes reference to that team, right? So it's that kind of idea of where language models can be used. So we can help our students with that, but like I said, I know there's also lots of intentional design that these companies are engaging in to try and scaffold that more as well.
Okay, this.
You can talk more about the reasoning process is a slow process, and the AI do the answers very fast, and the students lost this process that is slow. How can you?
Yeah. So one thing I like to do is to have examples of that. So what you do is you interact with the language model, like you interact with the language model. You give it some problem to solve. You ask it to reason step by step. Or some of these models are reasoning models, so they'll output their chain of thought. There's set aside the question of whether that's actually how they're reasoning. The point is, you get some output that should show some step-by-step reasoning process, and now give that to the students. And you have an intentional exercise of having students basically critique that reasoning, highlight what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, why does it make sense. You can scaffold that differently. You can say, okay, focus on this paragraph. What in this paragraph is incorrect? Like if you know, for example, that something's incorrect. Or you can say, what in this paragraph is correct. You can also take that output and you can tweak it, you can modify it yourself, right? So you can intentionally put something that's wrong in there, have the student then, as part of their exercise, need to read, go through, identify what's incorrect. So that's like another way. And the point of that exercise is to help them, like you said, just not get lost and just read through, but also B, and start to practice that skill of critically thinking, all right, like, is this, do I think this is correct? Do I think this is correct? And so on. Now, the less scaffolded version of the assignment is just give them the reasoning and have them do a general critique. And I think what works better is to have it very scaffolded to begin with. So you tell them there is something wrong in these 3 sentences. So that way they know they need to read critically. And then the idea is over time, you give them less and less instruction. Maybe the first exercise you say, there's something wrong in these 3 sentences. The next one you say, there's something wrong in these 3 paragraphs. The next one you say, is there something wrong in this? Right? And that way you sort of scaffold along and you try and help students develop that reflection themselves. But the point is, you can also start by just giving them good examples of the reasoning process. And that gets back to this idea of what I was talking about earlier with like the observation and the emulation is the phrase, but it's basically copying. And it's them seeing what does a good step-by-step reasoning process look like. That's like another way. Yeah.
I'd also add to your point about reasoning that we as instructors can give students a lot to help them become better users. And being a better user would be breaking up a hard problem into smaller steps, like we do in engineering. So can you help students find how to break up a problem into discrete steps that they can give to a model, see the model's response, now do another one, see the model's response, do another one, right? And you could tweak those, like Andrew was just saying, but it requires them to develop their own reasoning, develop an understanding for how the model's going to behave, and it also helps you as an instructor have more control over their use of the technology versus just, hey, I'm just going to give it every single problem, see what happens. Yeah. And to that point, prompt libraries could be very helpful for your class. Like if you gave students at the beginning of the semester or midway through the semester, a list of prompts that you use or other people use, acceptable prompts, ones that maybe would be, you'd consider cheating, right? That would be very helpful because there's such variety in the types of policies that students have class to class and even institution to institution, that if you give them, hey, here are prompts that I approve of, that I think are good prompts, let's talk about why they're good. Let's talk about why they're ethical, right? It would give them more support. And that goes back, that goes back to Andrew's different levels of prompting strategies. But being really clear as an instructor is helpful there.
Yep. Questions?
So, just following this last thing, so you're saying that we need to model our students to use AI. So just for a simple example, we ask them a question. So a cheating question would be repeat exactly the question into the AI. Is that so? So instead of actually just resolving the question, the exercise, or the activity, whatever it is, you go to parts that can help you to develop instead of going straight to the answer. Is that so?
Yeah, that's the idea as well. And this also gets to something, so I don't know how common this practice is, but another thing that you can do is flipped classrooms. So are you all familiar with this? Okay, so because the idea here is that it's a common practice to give students the work to do at home. And with flipped classrooms, now you're giving them some material to learn at home, and then in class, you're actually having them work through exercises. The point there is it gets back to what I was saying. If you're trying to assess fundamental skills, then you can be a little bit more, you have more visibility into what they're actually doing when they're solving those problems because they're solving them in class. So that's an instance where you can see, like, well, to what extent are they using AI for cheating? What does that kind of interaction look like? But yeah, that is what Mitch was. Mitch doesn't need to talk.
Good idea. Thanks.
Perhaps this is more of a philosophical point or something like that, but everything that you said made sense to me, and it seems an invaluable way to help students use AI because that's inevitable anyway. But thinking back about the way I started to learn math as a teenager, or physics, or actually anything, writing was a very fundamental way for me to solidify what I learned. And the point is that I feel that perhaps even a reasonable use of AI will make students less prone to writing stuff, and so do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. Okay, so yes, so I'll say something and then I'll pass it off to Mitch because I know Mitch has thoughts as well. So the first thing is just to point to some of the initial studies that are already coming out about the effects of AI use on skills, for example. In this observation across a few different contexts, so medicine, for example, is one that comes to mind, where the more AI people were using, the more there was like a degradation, or like a decline in their skill level. So if you did this with doctors, like with radiologists, so people who like read x-rays, and then if the more AI they were using, then if you took that AI use away from them, right, they had a sort of decline. So this isn't quite what you were saying, but there is a piece of it's like, if students are using this for solving problems, and now you take that AI use away, then does that skill go away? You were talking more about like the writing piece, but there's also that, so just in general, my instinct would be the same as yours, which is the more you see that use, now as soon as that tool is not there, now there's a big degradation in terms of what they can do. So like that's one instance, for example. I'll pass it to Mitch, and I've got more thoughts.
Yeah, it's definitely a concern, and there's a lot of research about over-reliance, too, coming out. But to your point about using this to write and to learn, I think what you said is what I would give you as feedback for your students. Because what you said was that you used writing, and you gave me a justification for why writing was helpful to you. It helped you learn, it helped you get these ideas into your head, to embody it, right? You gave me a justification. Giving justifications to students is very powerful because often we just give them a problem and say, go solve it. And they go to their friends and say, I don't know why I'm learning this, it doesn't matter. But if you then do that same thing and AI is available and they just go and use AI, well, it's not valuable, I just do whatever I want, right? So what if you gave them more justifications and you said, I want you not to use AI because this is a fundamental skill that is required for blah, 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 blah. Or here's an assignment I have and I will allow you to use AI for a small part of it. And the reason I want you to use AI for a small part of it is because blah, 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 right? Giving that justification is very powerful. And it helps students understand the utility that that assignment has for them, for their learning, for their future. And if you can relate it to those ideas, that's very impactful for students. So I would encourage you, if you're finding situations where students are just using it all the time to, one, add some diversity into the types of AI that are allowed. So maybe it can be allowed for small parts the whole time, right? Or not at all, right? Like there's a gradation. But then also to give them very concrete justifications for why that level of AI use is appropriate, and to stick with it and really hold to it as an instructor. Like just don't budge, right? Because we need to show them both as like authorities in these fields, but also as people who know learning, what learning is helpful and what learning they should and should not be doing. So I hope that helps a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and on this note of being intentional, so this was one of the things, yes, great. It only took me 10 minutes to get there. Okay, so one of the things I was talking about for like why talking about theory at the beginning as well was to Mitch's point about like being intentional with what you're telling your students, like why you're doing these things and the justifications there. That was also the reason for starting with some of this theoretical overview, let's say, is so you had these things to be able to point to and say, hey, look, here's this theory of how people learn. Here's why we're using this specific way of thinking about things. Here's why we're doing this problem. Here's why we have this assignment framed this way, and so on. So yeah, that justification piece, I think, can make a big difference.
I'll even say from an industry standpoint, if you were to tell your students, like, imagine yourself in 5 years, you're working for a company, and every single thing that someone tells you, you have to use AI to solve. Would that make you feel good about yourself? I wouldn't feel good about that, right? Like, we can be practical with them, right? They have a lot of stuff happening in their lives, a lot of things to juggle, a lot of things to balance. They don't want to cheat. I really believe that students don't want to cheat. They don't want to use these tools and undermine their learning. So I think we can be frank with them and say, listen, if you're going to use these tools all the time, you think it's going to get better for you down the road? You think one day you're just going to wake up and, oh, I know it all. Like, that doesn't happen. Learning's really hard. So if you're uncomfortable, let's lean into that uncomfort and figure out ways to deal with it. But using AI is not the right strategy. Yeah, exactly. Why do they need you? Just hire an AI, right? That's what you're doing anyway. What are you for? Yeah, exactly. It's cheaper, yeah. And in that case, I think you just made me think, it's an argument to build on students' individuality, their uniqueness, because I'm hiring you because I want you. Not because I want this AI that I could just do the work for, right? So what is it that you are contributing? What is it that you are bringing to the table? I want that. So develop it, right? Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah?
That the students could feed the AI LLM with class notes or the books and the old exams, and could do a procedure to study the discipline or the program of the, or simulate the new exams. How do you think about that? This form to study and to prepare and to...
Yeah, so a few thoughts on that. The tricky thing, and this goes to what you were saying earlier, of like how do you get students to be able to reflect on that reasoning if they don't have that skill built up to begin with. It's the same challenge, I think, if students are going to use those tools just for their, for helping them learn or review materials from class, is you're still depending on whatever that output is. And if they're not really critically thinking or don't have the ability to critically think and stop and think, wait, does this make sense? And if instead they just have this reaction, kind of like with textbooks, right? I'm sure lots of us read textbooks and think this is flawless, but like I'm sure most of us got to a point where you could read a textbook and say, oh, no, like this, there was an error here. It happens all the time. So it's the same sort of thing. Like if students don't have that ability to stop and think, okay, yeah, I gave all the notes for this unit to the AI system, asked it to generate a practice quiz for me, and generate answers to those quizzes. If they can't stop and think for themselves, like, is this answer that the AI suggested correct? Like, then that's still going to have that problem. So that's why I think like that, the ability to stop, critically think, reason through, that's the skill that they need to have. And the first step there is just having them realize that AI output is not perfect, like not necessarily perfect, right? And it really is just generating what's the most likely next token, doing it, chaining it along that way. So having them do that, I think, is really important. And until they have that, I mean, it's a very dangerous thing, right? Because then they can just start putting it in, putting all their class notes in, say generate a quiz, generate a practice quiz, or explain this. If they don't have that ability to stop and think, that's going to create, it's almost, do you have students who work in study groups? Have you ever had the experience where students are working in a study group and one student has a misconception, but they're a very convincing student, and now all the students in that group have a misconception, right? It's that same kind of problem that you can run into. So that's one thought, is just, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but just helping students realize if that's their approach to engaging with the AI system, then they need to also work on stopping, thinking, reflecting, having some way and some scaffolded approach to actually critically analyzing what is that output. Does that check with my own sort of instincts? And this gets back a little bit to what I was saying with that, the predictive processing model when I asked you all, okay, what do you think I'm going to say next? Right? Students need to have that ability to stop and think, okay, what do I think the AI output, what do I think the correct output is? And then when there's that gap, right, so maybe students solved a problem one way, they checked the AI system, it was different. They need to have that ability to say, okay, like, where is there a gap? Why is there that gap? Is that the same or different? Otherwise, yeah, it gets too difficult to just take everything. Until these models are flawless, which, tough to imagine that, but until they're at that point, I think that's the problem.
And thinking about it after you asked your question, if I hear you right, you're asking, how do I avoid students just filling the context with everything and just being able to do, right? And a possible solution is to make it so that the context is almost impossible to provide. And an example of that would be if you ask them questions that require their world knowledge, their common sense. Or, as an example, like their own personal life stories, their personal experiences. Because if I have to write paragraph after paragraph as input to the model so that it then outputs the right thing, I might as well do the assignment myself, right? Like if you were to give it some type of, go out into, Sao Paulo, find a building that looked like it was built in a cool way, right? And go walk around, talk with someone in the building about their experience in that, right? Sure, someone could cheat. Someone could use a model and they could but that's cheating. And we've always had students who cheat. But in that situation, well, here's a task that requires you to get up, do something, experience it yourself. And at that point, you've probably learned a good bit. You've probably thought about the whole experience and what it means for your learning. It's probably very valuable to you because you saw it in your everyday life too. And it becomes then very hard for them to give that type of experience to the model for them to then answer a question. So maybe think about ways that you could make your assignments a little more resilient by taking the context and making that context really hard to provide. And it's always going to change, right? These models are going to get better. They're going to get better at understanding our intent with less words provided. But I think if you're asking yourself, is this a type of question that's easily context engineered? Or is this something that really requires the student's world knowledge That might help you. Yeah.
And another thing is when your students have all these old exams and everything to work with and put in the AI and resolve for studying, I think it's a common sense that everybody knows when you're watching TV, you're watching a cook program out there. You're watching, you don't know how to cook. When you see a movie, you see a lot of war movies or fight movies, you don't know how to fight. And you need to tell them that. It's not because you're watching this resolution that you're learning. You need to try by yourself without that. If you can do this, that's okay. But sometimes it helps. But it's not going to assure you that next time you will be able to do it by yourself. So they need to know that. You can tell them. What do you think?
Yeah, and on that same thing, that's where that idea of like that observation, emulation, self-regulation comes in, is them, maybe being able to observe a cooking show, you're seeing someone cook, right? That's step one. Then emulation is copy it yourself, right? You try and do that same recipe your own, right? And the third one is, okay, now you try a new recipe without having seen it cooked, right? It's that same kind of idea.
Questions?
It's possible to use the AI with a group interacting with the same environment, collecting the inputs of all the students of the group. It's possible. Do you understand?
Yeah, like in theory, yes. I'm not familiar with any like commercial products right now.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with any commercial products now, but in theory, it is possible. Like there are ways to design systems like using open source tools to do that. But like I haven't seen any. The only thing like collaborative thing I've seen so far is more just like you being able to share a conversation with somebody else, but that doesn't mean that they can then join that conversation.
They are thinking. Another question about the learning styles. You can put the learning style of each student to do a better procedure to study. It's possible.
Yeah. There's a lot.
In the prompt, you put in the prompt. I learn with visual or practice or
And
reading
yeah. And some tools now are making it very easy to do that, like Google's Gemini. Now, I don't know if you've seen, but when you ask a prompt when you submit a prompt sometimes, it will create an artifact. It will like write, all this stuff and it'll make like a document. Some Gemini now lets you select like canvas or infographic, and it'll just change the output to be an image or a chart or something like that. You could also specifically prompt the model and say, you have a role, right? You're this, blah, 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 blah. And I want as an output a figure or a table, whatever it is. And that would be maybe a good opportunity to talk with students about context engineering and making a good prompt and what goes into a good prompt, and how you can make a good prompt based on your personal learning styles, your personal preferences. So, yeah. And to your point about the collaborative one, I'm not sure about group level dynamics like that, but I've experienced models hosted by universities that allow the instructors to monitor students' activities, not their full chats, but their length of chats, the duration that they spent on it, the amount of interactions, maybe general topics, but that would require you to work with your institution to create that type of capability, and then also for students to use it versus the ones that aren't tracked. So not the simplest solution there.
So I wanted to pull this up because it's an example of that Google approach that I was talking about these different companies creating this more personalized way of doing things. So this is an example of a product from Google, and it's just showing them basically creating two versions of an explanation for one of Newton's laws, I think in this case, but like using different examples, using different language based on, your own, and it could be learning style or learning preference or just like your own personal backgrounds. So that kind of thing, I think this came out last week or the week before. So it's definitely something that these companies work on.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Yeah. So we can come back to your first question. What's the answer for the first question? Yeah, the first slide. The first slide. Do you remember? Yeah, of course. If you have two guys, one that showed an exercise where he justified everything, and the other one that didn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, so my way of approaching that, and I can just remind everyone else, I can pull that question up. The scenario is you have two people, two students, they're solving a thermodynamics problem, and then the question is one person has all this documentation for their AI use, the other student does not have such documentation. Let me close this, present this. I guess the first question, maybe question 2 was like, is this happening in your class? Yes. The question is like, how do you grade them? And that's where I would have basically this extra rubric now. That is, so you still have the original way that you might be grading a student. So what were their calculations? Was their final solution correct? But then also now I'd be trying to grade their actual AI interaction. So what was the nature of the interaction? I would try and have some sort of rubric there, or talking about these different aspects of AI literacy. So like the prompts, how are they? Because it says here in the scenario, it's like they're documenting iterative prompt refinement. So I'd be trying to assess that, like how sophisticated was that prompt, how specific, like these kinds of questions. So I'd basically have these two tracks, and that gets back to what I had toward the end of the talk there about like, the different grade distribution. So maybe half the grade might now be just the original, was this correct? And half of it might be me trying to assess their use of AI. Or, like a 70-30 split, but something like that, yeah.
So I think we are finished. Yeah? Yeah. Want to say something else?
No, thank you all again. I do want to say one thing actually, which is that I owe slides now.
Oh, okay.
So I owe slides, but also, if at any point you all have questions, want to talk about anything, like I love my favorite part, one of my favorite parts, Mitch, close your ears. One of my favorite parts is working with faculty. One of my favorite parts of the job is working with faculty. I was going to say my favorite part of the job is working with faculty. Favorite part's working with grad students. One of my other favorite parts of the job is working with other faculty members, especially at other universities. It's a nice way to work across different contexts. So if at any point you're thinking about trying something, whatever, like don't ever hesitate to send me an email. It should be easy enough to find, but also sure it'll be included. So, sorry, yeah.
Can you talk more about this reference that the title is Hallucination of AI?
Yeah, so talking more about hallucinations?
Yes.
Oh, sure.
Because you use AI and ask about references, and they create some
hallucinating
hallucination
references? Oh, I mean, I can talk about it, but my basic instinct is to never, so I try very hard never to just ask for a reference, and any reference that's ever there, I assume it's wrong, and then I will go and check, and if it's right, it's like, oh, it's like a pleasant surprise. Like it's the extreme version of like trust but verify, like the old saying from Ronald Reagan from the 80s, thinking about, I don't know, Cold War politics. But I try and do the opposite. I basically don't trust and verify. So yeah, because when it comes to references, it's just there's no guarantee, there's no real built-in system. It's just awesome at making stuff up, because that's what it would look like if there was a reference. Yeah.
I use the Perplexity AI,
Yeah.
and they present
That's a good point.
real reference.
So are people familiar? Yeah, it's a good point. So are people familiar with Perplexity, that specific website? It's a website that you can go to, ask a question. The idea is that the answers need to be grounded in some actual references, so it's not. The sources should be traceable, is the idea. So if you ask it a question like, what are the 3 constructs in self-regulated learning? It should answer that, but it should answer that by pulling in references. And the point is then you can click on those references. So that's kind of different than me going to ChatGPT and just saying, what are popular papers about self-regulated learning, where it may or may not pull those up. They're also getting a little bit better, though. They're getting better. ChatGPT is trying, like OpenAI is trying to build in references now as well. Because, all these companies, the idea is they want to have a search engine, like a browser, like a web browser, so that you go there to do all your web browsing, so that eventually when you're doing like your shopping, they can also reference products to you, because that's how they're going to make money, right? Their way of making money is by getting advertising money. That's, Google has basically a monopoly on internet advertisement now, so they want to go after that money. The way they go after that money is by getting you to go there, search for things. Now they can link out to other products, so they want to be able to link out to things. They can include links in their references, in their answers to you. So for getting academic, so that's what it's going to look like on the commercial side. But then also, just like academic references, they will also just build in the ability to link out to other websites or papers or things like that. But yeah, but Perplexity is a good example of a tool that is better at that, for sure.
Anything else? Mais alguma coisa? So we may thank you and finish. Yeah? Okay, thank you. And, well, todos estamos convidados a entrar em contato com ele. We are invited to contact you. Yeah, I have. Eu tenho. Eu te passo. Okay? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.